Welcome to the latest edition of the MBN Iran podcast. With me today, I have Holly Dagres, who's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute and also the curator of the Iranist Substack. Also with me are Leila Bazzi, who's the editor-in-chief of MBN. And as we talk today, the world is focusing on what the world has been focusing on about the war in Iran, with Iran, around Iran. And that is all the conversations that you tend to see are about the Strait of Hormuz, they're about the nuclear issue, all of which are important, but often neglected are the over 90 million people in Iran. And we're also going to be talking to Leila today about people in Lebanon, which of course is very involved in this conflict as well. So we want to talk about the human aspect. And I'm going to start right in with you, Holly. You know Iran better than most people I know, and you're in touch with people. Can you paint a picture of what are young Iranians saying, feeling, doing? You know, we live in 2026 in an era of social media. We live in an era of AI. We live in a new era from a generation or two ago. Can you give us a sense of the feel that you get about how things are shifting, Gen Z? What are young Iranians feeling and saying?
Well, first, thank you for having me on the show. Um, I should caveat it's really hard to measure what 90 million people are feeling in this moment, especially with the longest state imposed internet shutdown globally, which began on the first day of the war on February 28th. So it's really made people like myself, who obviously can no longer travel to Iran, and rely on the internet and social media to monitor the mood and the conversations, and also just to reach out to people a lot harder. And so, the little bit, that I've been able to hear and think about in this moment is that right now there's some Iranians that are getting online and some who I've been able to talk to about just the state of, affairs in terms of connectivities. There's something now called Internet Pro, which is tiered internet, which basically is a state-sponsored VPN that is unstable and monitored by the security apparatus. And the people that can't afford these VPNs are getting online, and they're not. It's not everyone, of course. Some people have unable to keep in touch with their friends and family because it's just so exorbitantly expensive for some of them. But, a lot of those people, like, the conversations are they're different things. Some are just focused on the economy. There's been all these internet businesses that have been heavily impacted. Instagram is the most popular social media app in Iran, and Iranians, used it for online businesses, and a lot of Iranian women actually that had become financially independent because of these online businesses, whether they were catering, selling handicrafts, and whatnot, or even teaching yoga, and, they found that they are losing their income. I think Iranian officials put the number of 20% of its 30 million workforce have been impacted by this, internet shutdown, and so a lot of people are really thinking about how to pay their rent, how to feed their families in this moment, and then the other side of it, and I should also add that there is something called domestic internet or intranet, and so banking, ride-hailing apps, and whatnot do work in the country, but it's not the same thing, of course. And then the other conversation that is being had is that people are shocked, the ones that are able to get online and see the narrative about the war and how much of the Islamic Republic's, version of events are being, shared online, such as the Lego AI generated videos, that were actually government contracted to a independent studio in Iran called Explosive Media. I remember hearing a story actually about this doctor that was just shocked at how many people were whitewashing the January anti-regime uprising that led to tens of thousands of Iranians being massacred. This doctor had treated protesters and had witnessed firsthand these crimes against humanity. And then there were people online denying it ever happened to begin with. And so, those have been some of the things I've been noticing, but, big picture, I mean, I think the war itself And the events since January have really, left, I would say, anti-regime Iranians feeling very alone. I think there was a sense um, that there was actually gonna be regime change. The president of the United States had famously said help is on the way and whatnot. And at the beginning of the war, you saw President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu come out and publicly say this is a regime change war. And then now you're seeing, at least they're attempting to negotiate with the same regime that killed protesters in January. And so I think some of those Iranians are feeling very alone in this moment because their lives have become infinitely worse because of the state of the economy, because of the war, and of course, because of the repression that's ongoing with thousands of arrests since the beginning of the war and dozens of executions, including some of those protesters. And so, a lot of young Iranians, I think, are just thinking about how to get by in this moment and and where their life is going to take them. And I think that they're probably feeling more hopeless than they ever did. And so they're unfortunately they're thinking about there some are having dark thoughts, and others are thinking, "Well, this is not a place to live. How the hell do I get out of Iran?" And so historically, Iran has had the largest brain drain globally, but I think now with the events on the ground with the massacre and then this war that has left them in a worse situation with a regime that's more hardline and repressive, they're going to be thinking about how to leave the country.
This is the safe scenario in Lebanon. If sorry for the interruption, and allow me Anders to that. There's a lot of similarities between what's happening to the people in Iran and the people in Lebanon. We do have over than 220,000 young generation left the country, and the population in Lebanon is not as big as the Iranian one. And the leaving the country is no longer a choice. It's the only way to survive. This is how it's becoming. And this is where I recently spoke with a Lebanese journalist who's a friend of mine, and he is known for being openly and loudly opposed to Hezbollah. We were talking about our villages because we are both from the south, and both our villages is destroyed now, and about what life has become for people in Dahieh in South Lebanon, even for the Lebanese. So every day, this is how it starts. You have your phone with you, alerts, maps, warning if you're gonna be bombed today or not, and how you're gonna flee. But the most important thing he told me about his 11 years old son, who's keeping on asking him about their village, why it was destroyed, who is responsible. He told me it was so hard to explain to a child that some people around him from the same village, even family, believe that this is an acceptable price to pay for another country, not even Lebanon, for Iran, another battle, not our own battle, and another leader. And this is where you realize that this is how it sounds, the life in Lebanon for the Lebanese and for the new generation.
It's like, what do you even say when you talk to young people in either of those countries? I'm really struck. One thing is people grow up accepting a level of cynicism. I think that that's underlying a lot of what you've described is you go to school or you hear your parents or friends or whatever with a certain narrative, and then that's not the reality that you're getting on the ground. And the cynicism, Ali, you mentioned the Internet Pro, and I was reading in the Iranian press, people are saying, well, okay, if the internet is being blocked for security reasons, and if it's security reasons, then how come then apparently security is abandoned if you can pony up the money to pay for the more expensive version? The security excuse goes out the window. And the constant level of cynicism, the massacres of January 8th and 9th, and I'm glad that you brought those up, because for a lot of people, everything started on February 28th, but the reality is, of course, that it's, well, arguably started 47 years ago, but most recently, the spate of demonstrations since December 28th and so on. And that, the regime just brazenly says, and of course now is hanging people who were protesters and claiming that they somehow fomented violence. I mean, these things and the level of cynicism as well in the narratives in Lebanon. And it's really crushing. You talk to young people and they grow up extremely cynical, in addition to the privations that they have to live through anyway with, runaway inflation and danger and so on. It's hard to find hope sometimes. And again, thinking about Iran, all of us who have been paying attention to Iran and care about it for so many years, the refrain is this going to be it? Is this going to finally do it? I mean, certainly with the Masajina Amini protests a few years ago, there was this feeling, aha, this is it. During the demonstrations at the end of December and early January, Iranian friends were texting me saying, do you think this is it? And as you said, Holly, it's the US president said, basically we're going to come and rescue and help. And it's a really tough one. Is what do people believe in when they become so cynical and they just want to leave? It's and I don't know, I'm curious because we've had things going on in Lebanon and Iran for some time. Does it feel qualitatively different in terms of how this generation, the Generation Z now, how it's dealing with or approaching the things that it's dissatisfied with?
Well, you talking about this pessimism, it reminded me before the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising, I was actually studying Gen Z, and I thought, who better to ask than dissident rapper Tumaj Salehi, who had become the voice of these youth before they were on the main stage. And one of the things he described was how nihilistically had become youth in Iran, and how there was this the anger and boiling anger and resentment of the regime. And he captured, of course, some of those frustrations in his rap lyrics. And then, of course, then Women Life Freedom happened after the killing of Mahsa Jina. And everybody always thinks about that woman as being women and girls led, but I genuinely think it was Gen Z led. Like these were young, like teenagers, some as young as 16 that were killed, like Serena, Nika, and so on. And it's because what happened is that, yes, Iran was an isolated country, but thanks to the internet and social media, they understood how the rest of the world lived, worked, and thought. And they wanted those things. They wanted a zendegi normal or a normal life. And they aspired to that. And that's why you saw these kids knowing full well that they would be met with bullets and batons. They went out to the streets. And then what surprised all of us, especially people that had been documenting human rights abuses by the Islamic Republic for decades, was that they did it in January again. And usually, I was talking to Roya Burmand of the Burmand Center, and she was saying, it really shocked us that, after the torture, the rape in the prisons, all these arrests, and of course, the events since Women Life Freedom, that these people would actually willingly go out in the streets yet again, knowing what was waiting for them. And for in such a short span of time, usually she said it would take like a decade for people to recover. And I think that was just a showing of a sense of desperation for how much people were willing to die for freedom and democracy, for those things they aspire to, that they see much of the world as living and they don't have.
The common thing is that women always pay the price in any crisis. Whatever is the crisis, whatever is the war, the first one is impacted is women. And since March 2026, and according to the UN Women, over than 500,000 women and girls in Lebanon have been displaced. Many of them Lebanese, Palestinians, and Syrian women. They were forced to flee not only for the second time, for the first time in just a couple of years. But the real story is not about the displacement, it's what's behind it. The woman suddenly becomes the responsible for everything, the children, the elderly relatives, the medicine, the food, and they are responsible for creating some sense of a home, safety inside overcrowded shelters with little or none privacy or support. Even after the ceasefire, the women were killed and injured while trying to return home. And at the same time, there were around 1,000 women who were pregnant. War does not stop life. War does not stop survival. And if I want to go to the generation, I can say my generation learned about rocket and war when we were 4 years old because I'm from the older generation. The new generation, like Iran, were born either after the revolution in Iran, and in Lebanon, they were born knowing that the war is behind them. They didn't know war like we know it. So they didn't understand the politics behind it. But now things have changed for them enormously. Now what you should be as the exception is their way of life. So you do have over than 300,000 children were displaced before even reaching their childhood. What do you expect from this generation to feel or to have hopes? They were talking about hope. And this generation, the same Iran and Lebanon, this is what do they know? So what do you expect from them in the future? They're going to try to escape, but at the same time, you cannot but know that they're going to be impacted with what's around them. Is it about the regime or about Hezbollah and Lebanon? It's not going to be easy. This is a very difficult path, what both countries are passing through. Even if you get rid of the regime, Haley, which is so difficult to get rid of a regime that it's built on ideology and army. The army person, the soldier for him, it's go, get it, or die. They don't back off that easily. And the same terminology is in Hezbollah, like, oh, one of the Hezbollah people were telling his own people, we're gonna keep on fighting until the last Shia in Lebanon. You don't owe the Shia, and the IRGC do not own all the 90 million Iranian, right?
And you wonder because, like, does a young Iranian really care about, I mean, the propaganda of the regime to the country? Do they really care about Hezbollah? Do young Lebanese care about Iran? I mean, they don't even border on each other, right? They're a few countries away from each other, and yet people constantly associate these two, and it's amazing how much of an effect they've had on each other.
I do not even speak the same language.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, so what's the path forward? I mean, because it's so dismal and I despair sometimes. So do either of you see hope somewhere?
For the first time in Lebanon's history, they did put a claim to the UN accusing Iran of disrupting the sovereignty of the country. That is a huge. If there's a hope, I'm gonna be hopeful.
Yeah. I mean, to Layla's point, I think hope springs eternal. You can't not be hopeful. If we don't have hope, what do we have left, you know? It's hard for me in this moment to really genuinely, with my analyst hat on, to feel hopeful because I see that the Iranian people are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I just see that their lives will likely get worse, just from the repression, the mismanagement, the corruption, the state of the economy, and of course, this water crisis that I assume the Islamic Republic won't solve. And so I think that this war has left them a lot worse off in this moment. I don't, but I also I think that, that suffering is eventually gonna probably lead to something with the regime itself because it hasn't been able to address those systemic issues that have driven people to the streets in recent years in cyclical anti-regime protests. So I think eventually something's gotta give there, but, it's also gonna be at the cost of a lot of Iranians and their well-being. And so I think eventually in my lifetime, I'll see the Islamic Republic gone, but I think it'll be a very costly one.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned water, and I was thinking the other day, that's something I was writing about a lot toward the end of last year because Tehran was about to run out of water and so on. And I thought, well, it's not like it got that much better. It's just because of the various crises, the attention on those issues has been displaced. But the underlying issues that were there before the protests that partially caused the protest, I mean, a lot of the protests you can attribute it to different things. There's a general dissatisfaction. There were specific triggers having to do with the currency losing value, and now, of course, it has even less value. But just the inability of this system that's so ideology based and spends so much money on this foreign adventurism to deliver the most basic services for its people. And that hasn't gotten any better. I mean, what's interesting, of course, and you can see it when you read what the regime puts out, is that it can now blame somebody, right? So now they have a whole new, I mean, they can, for quite some time to come, many issues, logistical infrastructure and domestic kind of service delivery issues, they can just blame on the war, right? You can see it's an old trick. I mean, the Soviet Union did the same thing, right? And but it doesn't feel sustainable. Of course, we've been saying that for a few decades now, but it does feel as though something will have to give. I also don't know how or when.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's really the question. We always, I think, the million-dollar question. Everybody's like, when is the regime gonna go? Or everybody's always saying that the regime's gonna, like every protest, the regime's gonna collapse or they're gonna be overthrown. And I think it's a lot of wishful thinking, but it's also a lot of misunderstanding of the Islamic Republic itself and how it works. I think, unfortunately, people see some clerics with beards and they assume they don't know anything. I think part of it is just like from an optical perspective, they really underestimate that. And they also, I mean, they also underestimate their abilities. Iran, yes, has a dated Air Force. It's clearly its air defense capabilities were awful because US and Israeli jets were able to do sorties over Tehran, and they can probably do it for foreseeable future. But their ability to resist and to survive and to adapt is what's allowed them to stay in power for as long as they have and be I would say, a zombie regime at this point.
And this is to your point, Haley. I had an interview with General Kemet. This is exactly what he said. They were counting that they're gonna try to elongate the war, and they were counting on Trump being impatient. So, and they are gonna try to survive it because they know they cannot win it. Exactly to your point.
I mean, as an Iranian, I mean, we talk about strategic patience, but I always say, like, Iranians are carpet weavers. They're very patient people. There's a lot of attention to detail. They spend a lot of time, and as you noted, Layla, like, they definitely wanted were counting on Trump to blink first, and arguably he has. A lot of his rhetorical threats have not happened because he thought that every time he said something, the Iranians would bend the knee. I don't fault necessarily, the people in government. I think there are a lot of really bright people that work on Iran, some of which have been fired from their job in the past year. But a lot of people, for example, knew and for years have been wargaming an Iran war and knew that the Strait of Hormuz was obviously going to be closed. So that doesn't surprise me at all. And it's always interesting for me to see how the president seems to think like a one size fits all. So if we can kill the leader in Venezuela and the next person will come up and make a deal with us, this must work with Iran. And so I think it's just it's kind of a cherry picking the information or intelligence you're given because you have your worldview differs than what the reality is.
Do you find that Western media is getting something wrong about how Iranians think or how Lebanese think? That there are some assumptions and misconceptions about how people actually feel. Bearing in mind, of course, you can't sort of summarize, millions of people. But do you read stuff where you just kind of go face palm? This is really irritating.
Anders, Iran and Lebanon are not the same on this question because Iran, as Haley puts it at the beginning, and she knows better, it's closed. It's not open to the internet. While Lebanon is a very open country, and you have a lot of media getting in and getting out. So maybe the Western media, and Haley can answer to the Iran part. I'm not sure how far do they know about Iran, but about Lebanon, I believe, and I can see it, and I can sense it, and read it, and watch it. They are started to see the difference because there are more voices now in Lebanon, against what's happening in the country, even from the government level. As I said now that they filed a complaint at the UN, the Lebanese government, there's, for the first time in more than 30 years, a talk with Israel about maybe a peace or some kind of a security deal, whatever that is. 70 to 80% of the Lebanese people are with that if Israel withdraw. And the Shia, who are, they say it's all Hezbollah. No, it's not. Now you can hear Shia voices against Hezbollah. And what's so bad, and I think human rights should point to this so soon, is if you are a Shia and you have your house that's being destroyed, or if you have somebody killed from your family, if you went on the media and said that, they are accusing you of treason. They cannot even mourn neither their properties, neither the loved ones. So there is a difference, and the Western media is starting to put some more light on that and understanding more what's happening in Lebanon. As for Iran, Hailey can put light more on that.
With Iran, it's complicated because, of course, we have plenty of Western journalists that live in Lebanon and travel to and from, and they're not dealing with the same hurdles as a Western journalist in in Iran, which there are few. And the ones that do visit are with a minder, and so you're only getting like a very skewed version of events of what Iran is in that moment. And oftentimes it's platforming Iranian officials and they're taken to parts of Tehran. Although I've seen some very opinionated Iranians that don't care about the implications of speaking their mind, um, because they're just so fed up with the status quo. And so, I think, like, you get a very different picture oftentimes of Iran because of that limited, ability to freely report inside the country. And I know that's been a real frustration of the diaspora and, of course, before the war, Iranians that were able to get online. And that's why it's been so hard for people that are aware that are getting back online to see the narrative that's been controlled by the Islamic Republic since the war began, because you're anti-Trump or anti-war or both, you're actually sharing a lot of stuff that is pro-regime, or even mouthpieces like Mohammed Morandi. I see a lot of Americans agreeing with him and not knowing his unofficial role with the Iranian government, that his father was a physician to the supreme leader, that he travels with the nuclear negotiating team. So clearly he's in it with the regime. And because of this anti-imperialistic lens that some people lean into, or their anti-war stance or anti-Trump stance, they're sharing this content online and then actually believing what they say, including that a massacre never happened, or that allegedly Israel was behind the massacre, and that it was like actually manufacturing consent for the war, which is such a insulting thing to say to protesters who have been out in the streets for years now. And so, it's been really, tough to see in this moment how much of that's happening, since February.
It is shocking. I remember when Afghanistan was falling to the Taliban again in 2021, uh, picking up some people's kind of joy rooted in their anti-Americanism or some perception of that it's an anti-colonial battle. They were basically cheering the Taliban. And I'm thinking, okay, you know, does what the Taliban represent and the policies they're going to be implementing, is that really in accordance with your belief system? But of course, they didn't think that far. It's a tough one. Uh, I'd like to.
It's Yeah, I was gonna say it's so much easier to sit in your ivory tower in the United States or Canada or Europe and support the Taliban or the Islamic Republic than actually going and living under these regimes.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. That's little bit of double standard. Yeah.
It is, and I know you lived under Itali, and
I was privileged though, so I recognize my privilege. I lived in Iran on an American passport. I had the option to come and go. I lived on dollars, so I yes, I lived it having to wear mandatory hijab, but, like, my life experience was one of privilege compared to the average Iranian woman that had to live under gender apartheid.
I do highly recommend your Substack, The Iranist, to people because it's a great way to find out what's really going on, and you're such an eloquent spokesperson for the realities of Iran. I'd like to thank you both, Holly, for your time coming on the podcast today. I hope we can have you again in the near future. We can check in and see how things are changing, hopefully for the better. Thank you, Leila, Editor-in-Chief at MBN, for shedding some light on what's going on in Lebanon. And for those of you who are watching this, you can check it out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, or the MBN website. And you can, of course, subscribe to one of the or all of the MBN newsletters. There are 2 a week that are general, covering the Middle East in both Arabic and English. And there are 2 Iran newsletters that are done by yours truly every Monday and Thursday. And check it out. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you both again for shedding light on what's going on in Iran and Lebanon.